Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you may be. It is my great pleasure to welcome you at the occasion of the 172nd Cutter Lecture on Preventive Medicine. My name is Bert Hofman. The Cutter Lecture has been presented once or twice a year since 1912 under the bequest of John Clarence Cutter, a graduate of Harvard Medical School. It is the oldest lecture series in epidemiology and preventive medicine worldwide, and it is presented and has been presented under the auspices of the Department of Epidemiology of the Harvard School of Public Health, now the Harvard Chan School. I am just there to introduce the speaker, but not so much directly the Cutter Lecture. No, my introduction is for our Dean of the faculty, Dr. Michelle Williams. She is also the Angelopoulos Professor of Public Health and International Development. And she has agreed, and I'm very grateful for that, she has agreed to introduce our lecturer, 172nd Cutter Lecturer, and to speak the Laudatio for him. May I give the floor to Dr. Michelle Williams.
Thank you, Bert, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome again, and thank you for joining us. It is an honor to welcome all of you today and to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Sherman James, the Susan B. King Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Public Policy at Stanford's School of Public Policy. Prior to his service at Duke, which extended from the period of 2003 to 2014, Professor James was a professor of epidemiology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and at the University of Michigan. Dr. James has focused his research on the social determinants of racial and ethnic disparities in health and healthcare. He originated the John Henryism hypothesis, which posits that repeated high-effort coping with social and economic adversity rooted in structural racism accelerates the risk of cardiometabolic disorders in Black Americans. Dr. James was elected to the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, in 2000, and to the American Academy of Political and Social Science in 2016. He served as president of the Society for Epidemiologic Research from 2007 to 2008. Dr. James has been recognized with several prestigious awards for his important work. He received the Abraham Lilienfeld Award from the epidemiology section of the American Public Health Association for career teaching excellence. He also received the John Castle Distinguished Lecturer and Award from the Society of Epidemiologic Research, the Wade Hampton Frost Award from the epidemiology section of the American Health Association, and the Kenneth J. Rothman Career Accomplishment Award from the Society for Epidemiologic Research. Today, we have the privilege and honor to hear Professor James present the 172nd Cutter Lecture in Preventive Medicine. And the title of his lecture is To Race with the World, John Henryism and the Health of Black Americans. Dr. James, thank you for being with us today. We are very much looking forward to your talk. And please, I ask you all to join me in welcoming Dr. James as our esteemed Cutter Lecturer.
Good afternoon. Thank you very, very much, Dewings, for such a nice introduction. I was delighted to receive the invitation from Dr. Hoffman to give the Cutter Lecture this year. I consider it a great honor. But my research, let me share my slides. Okay. Yes, so the title of my talk is shown here, To Race with the World, John Henryism and Health of Black Americans. My research on John Henryism and the health, specifically the cardiovascular health of Black Americans, was inspired by my encounter with a remarkable man whose name was John Henry Martin. This was 1978 when I was very young and very much wet behind the ears, a young professor of epidemiology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And Mr. Martin's life story, especially his account of the circumstances preceding the onset in his mid-50s of multiple physical health problems, high blood pressure, a very severe case of stomach ulcers, and later on, a debilitating case of osteoarthritis, struck me as an uncanny echo of the circumstances leading up to the sudden death of his namesake, the legendary John Henry, the steel driving man. Now, this John Henry, this one shown here on the slide, was probably a recently emancipated slave who, like thousands of other recently emancipated slaves, was given a lengthy prison term for some petty crime. And while in prison, he was forced to work on railroads, constructing railroads and tunneling through mountains so that private railroad companies could participate in connecting the eastern part of the United States with the western part of the United States following the Civil War. Well, John Henry, the legendary John Henry, was an amazing physical specimen, known throughout the South for his incredible physical strength and steel driving prowess. And one day he was challenged by the captain, by his supervisor, to compete in a steel driving contest against a newly invented machine. And he engaged the machine in an epic contest. He won, but he dropped dead immediately after the contest was over from complete exhaustion. Now, John Henry Martin, the retired North Carolina black farmer, also competed against a machine, but in his case, it was the highly exploitative sharecropper system of the rural South. In the system, poor, uneducated Blacks grew commercial crops on land held by wealthy whites, and in return, they were promised 50% of the profits from the sale of the crops. But it rarely turned out that way. This labor system was deliberately designed to keep Blacks in the rural South economically dependent on the white upper class, who controlled the economy and just about everything else. So this was the system then that John Henry Martin was born into and came of age. And when he was in his early 30s, he became fed up with being exploited in this way. And he vowed to break free of this system by taking out a bank mortgage to buy his own farm. And as we see in the quote here, he'd been thinking about breaking free of that system for some time. He was fed up with working for the white man, as he put it, and getting only half of his labor. He just did not like it. So he was able to obtain a mortgage from a bank. He had 40 years to pay for it, but he worked night and day. He wanted to pay it off in 1 year, but he managed to pay it off in 5 years. And then he added in the oral history that I recorded in a follow-up meeting with him, oh yeah, that's my trouble. I work too hard. Now, John Henry Martin, as I indicated, was born he was born at the dawn of the 20th century, 1907, just 4 years after the great scholar W.B. Du Bois wrote his classic book, The Souls of Black Folk, wherein he famously stated that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And at this time, 90% of all Black Americans lived in the South, many of whom lived in the rural South, and were therefore caught up in this sort of agrarian economy, much like the kind of situation that John Henry Martin was born into. Now, the color line that Du Bois spoke about was designed to exclude Blacks from mainstream institutions and to keep them subordinated. And it consisted of laws and social norms that were designed to prevent Blacks from having any kind of political power. So voter suppression was widespread, and a lot of voter intimidation, physical violence conducted against Black folks who tried to vote. Blacks were restricted to various parts of, if they lived in urban areas, parts of urban areas that were highly segregated, under-resourced in terms of sanitation, in terms of the school system, separate school systems, very limited education, and underfunded schools. And of course, I've already spoken about the system of labor exploitation, whether we're talking about convict labor or sharecropping. And as Leon Litwack, the historian, said, that the purpose of these Jim Crow laws was not so much the separation of the races as it was the subordination, and I might add the exploitation of the Black population. Now, later on in the opening essay of Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk, after he talked about the problem of the 20th century being the problem of the color line, he then said this: a people thus handicapped by all of these mechanisms of Black exclusion and subjugation, a people thus handicapped ought not to be asked to race with the world. Before this, there arises a sickening despair that would disarm and discourage any nation, save the Black host, save Black Americans, to whom discouragement is an unwritten word. And John Henry Martin, the Black farmer, like his legendary namesake, the steer driving man, refused to be discouraged. And as Du Bois suggests here in this quote, Black Americans as a whole refused to be discouraged. They chose to race with the world, to seek to have agency and some degree of control over their lives, despite the constraints of structural racism. Now, my 1978 encounter with John Henry Martin greatly influenced the way that I came to understand the factors that might have given rise to the data shown in this figure, taken from a very memorable paper that was published in the American Journal of Epidemiology in 1977, just a few years after I began my career at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And the well-known inverse gradient that we see here between education, a standard measure socioeconomic status and the prevalence of hypertension, that inverse gradient is present for both Blacks and whites. The black bars represent the gradient for Black Americans, and the gray bar, the gradient for white Americans. So we see an inverse gradient for both racial groups. This is a very large sample, 159,000 people who were being studied in connection with a very famous community-based trial to evaluate the efficacy of treating mild hypertension, then defined as a diastolic blood pressure between 90 and 95. So we see a Black excess prevalence, however, across all of the various categories of education, and something, 40 to 50% excess, 60 to 100% excess, really, if you look at the prevalence ratios indicated here on the bottom. So I began to wonder then, when I looked at this graph, and thinking about the story of John Henry Martin, his struggle against systemic racism, I began to wonder if his story was also the story of less well-educated working class Black folks all over America. Many, maybe most of whom, were confronted with some version of structural racism akin to the kind of circumstances that John Henry Martin faced, and were responding to those systemic constraints in a way that was not terribly different from the way that John Henry Martin responded to those constraints. And I had begun to recall, I had begun to think about this way of responding to these systemic constraints, John Henryism, in tribute, to the legend of John Henry, the steel driving man, and in tribute to the wonderful, remarkable story of John Henry Martin. And my thinking about the meaning of these data was further informed by 1970s laboratory and field research, and a wonderful synthesis of this literature by Lynn Syme at Berkeley regarding how systolic blood pressure and heart rate will increase in a very dramatic fashion when individuals are threatened with some kind of stimulus, some kind of adverse circumstance. And as long as they concentrated on trying to solve the problem, trying to overcome the threatening situation, their heart rate and blood pressure remained elevated. But if they concluded that the problem or the threat that they were facing could not be solved, they gave up. Or if they managed to solve the problem, then their heart rate and blood pressure returned to normal. So there were a number of laboratory studies and field studies that sort of demonstrated this phenomenon in a highly reliable way. Now, growing up in the segregated South of the 1950s, I had seen countless examples of what I was now calling John Henryism. Many of the hardworking, determined working class Black folks in the community that I grew up in had high blood pressure. And so it seemed reasonable to me to speculate that a John Henryism-like high effort coping response on their part to these structural constraints might be playing a role in the marked excess prevalence of hypertension among Black Americans that we see here, especially among those who are less well educated. So I then proceeded to formalize my definition of the construct of John Henryism, shown here as I called it a strong behavioral disposition to confront adversity with determined high effort coping the kind of higher level coping that John Henry Martin engaged in, the legendary John Henry, the steel driver, engaged in, this determination, to be successful, to overcome the threat, if you will. And for Black Americans, adversity consists primarily of undue hardship. I mean, the greatest form of adversity is this undue hardship caused by laws, societal norms, and institutional practices, structural racism that constrain significant upward social mobility. Again, I made reference to what the purpose of the Jim Crow laws were. It's precisely this, to constrain any significant upward social mobility on the part of the Black population. And then I developed a 12-item scale to measure John Henryism called the JACC. This is the John Henryism Scale for Active Coping. Here are 2 illustrative items. When things don't go the way I want them to, that just makes me work even harder. It's not always easy, but I usually find a way to do the things I really need to get done. And the scale continues in this manner for an additional 10 items. The highest score that one can make on the scale is 60, and the lowest score that one can make is 12. And the higher the score, the higher the behavioral disposition to confront adversity with determined high effort coping. And since I developed the John Henryism scale in the mid-1980s, early mid-1980s, there have been a number of studies, my own and work done by other people, generating profiles of individuals who score high on the John Henryism scale. So here's what we know from those various studies. In terms of socioeconomic correlates, individuals who are less well educated tend to score higher. Individuals with a blue collar job also tend to score higher on John Henryism. African Americans tend to score higher on the John Henryism scale than any other group. Whites, Hispanics, there are a number of studies that have indicated that. And in terms of psychosocial characteristics, the overall profile is one that suggests very good mental health, a very positive psychological and social profile, high scores on self-rated health, low scores on perceived stress, good social integration, good social support, low risk for depression, substance abuse, high scores on conscientiousness and energy, and also good high scores in terms of self-regulation. So high scores suggest some very, very positive things. Of course, the question is, what happens when people find themselves in what I call the John Henryism situation, and they're engaging these very difficult life circumstances, even though they might feel good in terms of their psychological profile. The question is, what kind of adverse effects are happening below the skin to their physiology? So that now leads me to talking about the John Henryism hypothesis. And I want to talk a bit about the biological rationale for the hypothesis. Stated here, repeated high effort coping with adversity accelerates physiological wear and tear, leading to an earlier onset of cardiovascular disease. And this behavior, this sort of behavioral orientation to life, when it is enacted, there's also the activation of the HPA axis, the flight or fight response. Once again, we see this illustrated in the life of John Henry Martin, who worked so very hard to pay off that loan, and in the legendary steel driver John Henry, who took on the machine and battled against it. So that fight or flight response and the repeated activation of the HPA axis, which of course then leads to surges of stress hormones, epinephrine, cortisol, and a whole cascade of circulatory changes and metabolic changes, and a remodeling, if this goes on for a long period of time, decades, for example, years and decades, this whole process could lead to a remodeling of the cardiovascular system and the onset of high blood pressure and atherosclerosis, and then in-organ damage in a variety of systems. So you can see that the biological rationale is embedded in the late Bruce McEwen's seminal work on allostatic load, and my understanding of the underlying biology undergirding the hypothesis has also been greatly enriched by Arlene Geronimus's work on weathering and Nancy Krieger's work on embodiment. This is a slide from Cardia showing the cumulative incidence of hypertension in that large cohort from the year of intake, or from the age of intake, around 18 years of age, through age 55. And you can see here that there really are no meaningful racial differences at all prior to age 20. But by the early to mid-20s, Black males, the blood pressure curve for Black males begins to separate itself from the other groups in a dramatic way. And after around age 45 or so, Black women, actually around age 35 or so, Black women begin to separate from whites, and by the late 40s, early 50s, they catch up with Black males, and afterwards probably surpass them. So there are no racial differences that we see in the literature. This is also consistent with what we know from the Bogalusa Heart Study, which has been a long-running study of Black children compared to white children, looking at cardiovascular disease onset and blood pressure curves and so on. So this is very consistent with what we know from other work. No racial differences prior to the late teens, early 20s, and then Black males really sort of take off in terms of their blood pressure risk. So it's an important question to know that, you know, with the John Henryism hypothesis, illuminate this earlier onset of high blood pressure in Blacks. The burden of hypertension in Blacks is really quite striking. This is a well-known slide from Health United States, CDC, MCHS. In this slide, you see that that Black folks are 50 to 75% at greater risk for high blood pressure than any other racial group in the United States. And there's now a general consensus, really, that high blood pressure is the most potent threat to the cardiovascular health of Black Americans, and is significantly responsible for the shorter life expectancy of Blacks relative to whites and other groups. So back to the slide from the hypertension detection and follow-up studies. So then the question becomes, when we look at this slide, if African Americans, if less well-educated working class African Americans score higher on John Henryism, as the literature suggests, than any other group of Blacks, and certainly, you know, other groups, and if less well-educated working class Blacks constitute a sizable proportion of the US Black population, could it be that that's why we see this extraordinarily high prevalence of hypertension among the less well-educated Blacks? The combination of scoring very high on John Henryism and then being confronted with very, very difficult day-to-day life problems that they were having trouble bringing under control or overcoming. Well, if that is the case, you know, if this idea that there's an interaction between John Henryism and one's socioeconomic circumstances, that the combination of scoring high on John Henryism and being embedded in very difficult socioeconomic circumstances puts one on a faster trajectory to develop cardiovascular disease, let's say in early adulthood, then that leads to the idea that the well-known inverse gradient between socioeconomic circumstances, let's call it socioeconomic disadvantage, the well-known inverse gradient might be more pronounced among individuals who score high on John Henryism than among those who score low. Now, the most stylized version of that interaction is that we would see the inverse association, the inverse social gradient with cardiovascular disease risk in the high John Henryism stratum, but little or no gradient in the low John Henryism gradient. That's the hypothesis, and that's the hypothesis that needs to be subjected to, obviously, empirical tests. This particular representation of the hypothesis features John Henryism as a categorical variable, scores divided at the median into high versus low. And importantly, the measure of socioeconomic disadvantage should accurately capture variation in chronic exposure to wear and tear like circumstances. That is to say, when testing the hypothesis, investigators need to give very careful attention in their choice of the SES measure such that individuals are correctly classified on the underlying construct of interest. And the underlying construct of interest is chronic exposure to wear and tear life circumstances. That's what you want to be reflected in the variation of scores on the SES measure. So it's a question of construct validity of the socioeconomic disadvantage measure. That is a precondition to conducting a valid test of the John Henryism hypothesis. And I think that some of the mixed results in the literature might be accounted for because the chosen measure has too much misclassification on the SES exposure vis-a-vis what that measure is intended to capture. And with that kind of misclassification, then one consequence of that would be a biasing of the study findings toward the null. That, at least, is one way to interpret some of the mixed results. In this particular representation of the hypothesis, John Henryism can be scored as a continuous variable. Socioeconomic disadvantage is dichotomized into high and low, but again, the basic idea is the same. At low levels of John Henryism, akin to the low John Henryism stratum in the previous slide, you don't see much of an excess risk associated with socioeconomic disadvantage, but CVD risk increases among persons who are embedded in conditions of socioeconomic disadvantage at high levels of John Henryism. Again, the interaction. Now, interestingly enough, the interaction also says that when individuals are embedded in life circumstances where there's relatively little or relatively low levels of disadvantage, there actually might be some protection associated with scoring high on John Henryism. And the way I think about that is because the psychosocial profile of people who score high on John Henryism is really quite favorable, right? They're energetic, they're good at self-regulation, they report good social support systems. And so the combination of all of these other, shall we say, social determinants of health, if they occupy favorable positions vis-a-vis some of these assets, then not being embedded in these very difficult life circumstances and scoring high on John Henryism could actually confer an advantage in terms of risk of cardiovascular disease. At least that is the theory. So here are some of the questions that have emerged in the literature, and I want to organize my presentation of the findings around these questions that the literature has addressed. Okay, so I started out thinking about Black men, did my very first study on Black men in the Eastern North Carolina community. So one question obviously is, does this also apply to Black women? Does it apply to Blacks? Does it apply to whites as well as Blacks? Is this a Black specific hypothesis, if you will. And the findings that I will show, I think, can be understood in terms of the legacy of structural racism in the United States. My early work was conducted in rural North Carolina, in the eastern part of the state. Again, I was a young professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill when I began this work. Does it apply to Blacks who live in urban environments? Is it a rural Black phenomenon, a rural Southern Black phenomenon? Does it apply to Black youth? Well, we saw that the separation of blood pressure curves for Black men in particular, relative to other groups, is not visible until the early 20s. Well, when does this phenomenon start? Can we see evidence of it, among Black children or Black adolescents? How early can the signal be detected? So these are some of the questions that I think that the literature can be organized to frame our discussion around. Okay, so here again is the interaction when John Henryism is treated as a dichotomous variable. This is if the empirical findings support the hypothesis, and John Henryism is categorized as a dichotomous variable, and you have a measure of socioeconomic disadvantage that has reasonable good validity, that is to say, misclassification on the exposure of interest is minimal. And this is what the picture should look like. So now let's review the findings and address some of the early questions. Black men and Black women, Blacks and whites. Well, my first study, conducted and published in 1983, focusing on Black men, was yes, the findings look exactly like the picture that I just showed you, where John Henryism was dichotomized. It modeled perfectly that picture. Does the hypothesis apply to Blacks, to whites as well as Blacks? Well, in the next study, we included Black men and Black women, white men and white women. It's a larger study, again, conducted in the eastern part of the state. The answer to the question for Black men and Black women, yes, we saw empirical support for the hypothesis for both Black men and Black women in this study, using a composite measure of socioeconomic disadvantage, education plus occupation. We did not find it for whites, however. And that led a lot of people to think that, well, maybe this is just sort of a Black phenomenon. I never thought that this was something that was specific to African Americans. I think the reason why we did not see empirical support for the hypothesis in the white population in this rural Eastern North Carolina community was because there was very limited variation on the SCS measure for whites. We had very few very wealthy whites in the study. We had very few extremely poor whites in the study. So we had truncated variation on the SCS measure. We had more variation on the SCS measure for Blacks. At least we had a sizable percentage of Blacks who were extremely disadvantaged, and then a subgroup that was not, not as highly disadvantaged. And so the effect, if you will, was evident. Well, another reason why I think that this is an hypothesis that has some relevance to the white population. We've had a couple of studies published on European populations. One conducted in Zutphen, the Netherlands, a nice little study, a small scale study. It was published in 1988, looking at testing the hypothesis vis-a-vis blood pressure in men, Dutch men and Dutch women. We found very good support for Dutch men, perfectly modeled that figure. Not so for women. Initially, yes, but once we control for number of covariates, the association ceased to be significant. Then we had a paper that was published in 2017 in Social Science and Medicine, a longitudinal study looking at future heart attacks, fatal and non-fatal heart attacks in men, Finnish men in Eastern Finland. And again, we received strong confirmation of the hypothesis, particularly for occupation. Trends were in the same direction for education, income, and childhood. Clearly then, this is not a phenomenon that is exclusive to Black Americans. We see it in a white population, in two white populations in Europe, particularly among men. And so I continue to believe then that the reason why we didn't see it initially in study in Eastern North Carolina for whites is because of limited variation on the SCS measure, and the fact that the Black population, they had all the dangerous high stress jobs that Southern society was organized in such a way, particularly in this largely rural community, that the skilled jobs went to white folks, the unskilled, very low paying jobs went to Black folks. So the legacy of structural racism, in a sense, protected the working class white population from being exposed to life conditions that accelerated physiological wear and tear. And we did not have enough well-off whites to really be able to make the kind of contrast that would have facilitated a better test. So we then conducted a study, again in Eastern North Carolina, in a community that was undergoing rapid urbanization, and the Black middle class was growing rapidly because of the biotech industry. The university was located there. And so there was a fast growing Black middle class, and the Black folks were beginning to occupy positions in predominantly white institutions to which they had historically not had access to. So it was a new circumstances for the Black middle class in this Eastern North Carolina community. It was a fairly large study, about 1,700 Black folks randomly selected. 66% of our study population were females. Was the hypothesis supported? Well, yes, but weakly. There was an interaction. We observed the interaction, the hypothesized interaction was attenuated because of a U-shaped relationship between job prestige and perceived stress scores. And perceived stress and blood pressure was positively associated with perceived stress in a separate study. In other words, high scores on perceived stress predicted high blood pressure, as we reported in a separate study in epidemiology in 1997. And so there was this U-shaped relationship between job prestige scores and perceived stress. And that U-shaped relationship, in the context of a linear relationship between perceived stress and blood pressure, resulted in an attenuation of the hypothesized interaction. So this perceived stress scale is a very good measure. It assesses how much one's life is dominated by worries, aggravations, and uncontrollable events. And here are a couple of illustrative items. So people are just having trouble kind of staying on top of things, getting things done in the way that they want to get them done, and just sort of feeling really, really stressed. A lot of wear and tear, if you will, psychologically and presumably physiologically. So this is the curvilinear relationship between job prestige scores and high scores on perceived stress that I talked about a moment ago. And you can see that that individuals in the highest category of job prestige, these are mid and upper level white collar workers, 194 of whom, 23% of these individuals had a score that was greater than 20 on a scale that for which the maximum score was 32. So that was surprising to us. You see that there is otherwise a nice linear, decrease in percent of high stress scores as you go from unskilled down through category 4 and 5, and then you get this strange uptick. So if the hypothesis were empirically supported by the data in this study that I just now referred to, this is what we would expect to see. Well, this is what we saw. We saw a nice inverse gradient among individuals in the high Jahn-Hinduism stratum. This is what we would have expected. But in the low Jahn-Hinduism stratum, we see equality for the low and medium SES categories, and then this sort of strange uptick, unexpected uptick for those in the high SES category, those mid and upper level white collar workers, particularly men. And my supposition is that these were individuals who were basically racial pioneers. They were breaking the glass ceiling, and they were experiencing some stress, some unusual stress associated with these novel work conditions in which they found themselves. We looked at job strain. Job strain did not explain it. So there was something else that was at work, and I think it probably had to do with sort of the racial environment in which these men and women, particularly men, were working. Okay, so what about rural and urban Blacks? Tuscaloosa, Alabama is a small urban city in Alabama, the home of the University of Alabama. No, the hypothesis was not supported, although Jahn-Hinduism main effects were. The measure of SCS in that study was education. I've already raised some concerns about the appropriateness, the ecological validity of some of the measures as one reason why we may not see full confirmation of the hypothesis. In cardia, no support for the hypothesis in cardia. That was an important no finding. Once again, education was the measure in cardio to test the interaction. In the Jackson Heart study, another major study of cardiovascular disease risk in Black Americans, we did see a trend in support of the hypothesis for men, not for women. And with respect to men, it was only with income. And income, of the four indicators of SCS used here, income was the only one of the four that had an inverse association with the stress measure in that study. Continuing with just a comment on, findings from urban, Blacks who live in urban areas, two very interesting and important studies conducted in the upper Midwest, one in Detroit, the other one in Chicago. And in these studies, we now have three populations. We have Blacks, whites, and Latinx folks. In Detroit, the population here was like 700 people. It was an inner city population, so there was really not a lot of variation on the SCS measure. I've indicated what the SCS measures were in that particular study. Each was used separately in separate tests of the hypothesis, and they did not find evidence to support the hypothesis in that study. Although, once again, they found Jahn-Hinduism main effects, but no interaction. In Chicago, a very large study, over 3,000 people, again, tri-racial ethnic population. They looked at both the prevalence of hypertension and body mass index. And in this study, the socioeconomic disadvantage was a standardized, a composite score of neighborhood level disadvantage. So standardized scores on this neighborhood level measure of socioeconomic disadvantage, which I think was a very appropriate thing to do because life circumstances in large, complex urban environments, the kind of stressors, economic stressors, concentrated poverty, noise, over-policing, these are things that can influence blood pressure levels and wear and tear life circumstances in ways that you don't see, at least to the same degree, in rural communities. So it's highly appropriate for these investigators to conceptualize the measure of socioeconomic disadvantage as a neighborhood level variable. And here is the result from their test of the interaction. looking at hypertension, and the results model perfectly the prediction. This is for hypertension. These are the findings for obesity. And once again, as you can see, the results perfectly match what was predicted from theory. Finally, I'll just say a word about Black youth. I know I'm running out of time. So how soon in the life course can you detect a signal for the John Henryism hypothesis? And in the mid-1990s, there was a nice little study published by some folks at the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta, looking at resting blood pressure, cardiac output, total peripheral vascular resistance in 173 10 to 17-year-old children. Now, these were both Black and white children. It turns out that there was a positive family history. At least one parent had high blood pressure. So there was a positive family history involved in the selection of these kids. But what we found was that on each of these three cardiovascular measures, the findings perfectly supported the hypothesis. And then in the last few years, Gene Brody and colleagues at the University of Georgia looking at young Black adults in 9 rural Georgia communities, looking at the predictive ability of the hypothesis to discriminate individuals at higher and lower risk metabolic syndrome. They were following these young Black adults from ages 11 to 18. That was when they were first enrolled, and they followed them through age 25, and they tested the hypothesis looking at metabolic syndrome. And for those children that I mentioned a moment ago, these are the results for total peripheral vascular resistance. You see that nice crossover, which provides evidence in support of the hypothesis. This is the finding for metabolic syndrome coming from the study by Gene Brody and colleagues. Again, a good confirmation of the hypothesis. Well, in terms of future research priorities, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. We need more longitudinal studies. We need harder clinical outcomes. We just have basically one really good longitudinal study, one that I talked about in Finland. We don't have any such studies like that in the United States, particularly among Black folks. We need some harder clinical outcomes, heart attacks, mortality, and so on. We need more work on children and adolescents. We need more work on neighborhood level effects, particularly when the hypothesis is tested in large urban settings. And we need more work looking at other diverse, racially and ethnically diverse marginalized populations, going beyond African Americans, again, to assess the generality of the hypothesis. Well, potential policy implications, obviously we need to invest in people and in places. If the hypothesis is correct, the problem is not high John Henryism in itself, it's the circumstances that people are confronted with. It's where they live. It's how much education they have. It's how much income they have. It's the resources that they have in order to live a decent life, in order to advance economically and to be well. So increase investments in people and in places. And obviously there's some discussion about doing precisely that now with the Biden-Harris American Rescue Plan. There's lots of evidence from other areas supporting the importance of early childhood developmental interventions and the really wonderful investment that we get when we invest in children, when we start early investing in their educational abilities and intellectual curiosity and helping them to self-regulate and to plan and so on. The evidence is really very, very powerful. These are basically small studies. We'll scale these up, and I think that we will we will see that society will benefit, marginalized populations will benefit, but society as a whole will benefit, because we're talking about growing the middle class and increasing the tax base and keeping people healthy and reducing crime and so on. So, and I think that high John Henryism, is, as I said before, not an intrinsically bad thing. It represents ambition, the desire to get ahead in life, and I think it would play very well. It would play well with the kinds of investments that we hope are made. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. James, I thank you so much for this fascinating Kotter lecture. An impressive set of evidence, and I must say it's wonderful to hear about your pioneering studies. And let's see, yes, also to see that you did this in major cardiovascular disease, hypertension detection and follow-up program, and in cardia, and in the Jackson Heart Study. Really very impressive, I think. Can I ask you a question? First of all, I'm going to look whether there are questions in the audience. And I invite people. Let's see. I see myself. I'm not sure whether you hear me, Dr. James. Do you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes, I can. Thank you for those
That's
comments.
great. I had a more general question, namely you focused, and it's very natural, on cardiovascular risk factors, on disease, on say hypertension. The other outcomes that you could look at, metabolic disease, yes. What is the evidence in general on other clinical outcomes? You mentioned this a little bit.
Well, we don't have a lot. I'm not aware of any evidence that goes beyond high blood pressure and metabolic syndrome. There are some studies that are being contemplated, but none has been published so far. I think that's an important question. I'd be very interested in looking at end-stage renal disease as an outcome. I think that would be a very important outcome.
Yes. Is there any one? Is one of the questions in? Is there evidence on the effect of response to medical treatment and associations in this case?
I'm not sure I understand what the questioner means by response to medical treatment. Is John Henryism associated with use of medical care or compliance with medication or those kinds of things?
I have the sense that indeed that is the question in case. Yes.
No, I am not aware. I'm not aware of any such studies. That's a really good question, and I'd be very interested in someone pursuing that.
Yes, and you mentioned in your in the overview that in particularly in the beginning, perhaps in many instances, there were incorrect conceptualizations of SES, choice of measure misclassification. Sometimes there was no variation in SES in whites, as you said. Is that since the studies have been going on, has that improved?
No, it has not. It has not, and I think that this is a very, very important consideration. When we think about our fellow scientists in other arenas, they pay an enormous amount of attention to calibrating their research instruments, making sure that their research instruments are measuring what they are intended to measure. And I think that epidemiologists can do, I think that we epidemiologists can do a much better job. We just need to be much more attentive to the accuracy of our measurements, particularly with respect to socioeconomic status variables, right? So so my point is, in testing the John Henryism hypothesis, is very important, in my view, to choose a measure of socioeconomic status or socioeconomic disadvantage that captures in a reliable way variations in chronic exposure to wear and tear life conditions. That's what you really want those scores to reflect. And in some circumstances, education might do that. Other circumstances, occupation might do it. But there are some other circumstances where those two measures simply don't capture the underlying phenomenon that you're interested in. And so you are misclassifying people on this key exposure. And this kind of misclassification is going to bias the results toward the null. So it's perfectly legitimate to be interested in the relationship between education and some outcome if you're interested in education per se. But if you want to understand and test in a rigorous way the John Henryism hypothesis, you need to pay attention to the choice of the measure and its ecological validity for the population that you're working with.
Thank you very, very much. Dr. Williams, I invite you for a question. I saw it in the Q&A. Please go ahead. If it at least is possible to give you the floor.
Yes, thank you. Tour de force, thank you, Professor James. And I, in thinking about the rigorous and really brilliant way you laid out the segmentation of testing hypotheses, I couldn't help but wonder, particularly now as we struggle nationally and globally with immigration policies that are, quite frankly, inhumane in many cases. If you have done segmentation of testing the hypotheses in different groupings of immigrants?
No. As far as I know, that work has not been done. And what a wonderful research question for the up and coming generation to take on. I mean, I think that is such a natural question. Whenever I would lecture on John Henryism to my students, undergraduate and graduate, and I would have first and second generation immigrant students in my classes, and they would say, "Oh, you're talking about my parents."
Exactly.
Those my parents you're talking about. Trying to make their way, into the system, trying to find their place, in American society, and working incredibly hard, right? And we know from epidemiological data, in other areas of research, that with increasing length of stay in the United States, that initial, protection, initial good health that immigrants have upon arrival, begins to decline. It doesn't take very long. It takes about 10 to 15 years before you begin to see this particular phenomenon. And this is true across immigrant populations of color. I have not seen this with white immigrant populations, but I've seen it with African immigrants, Caribbean immigrants, with immigrants coming from Central and South America. So there is something about being a person of color and coming to the United States and trying to find your place in the United States. And I would argue engaging in this phenomenon that I call John Henryism. I think that that's a part of, sort of driving the allostatic load, issue that we see. And Arlene Jormans and others have done some nice work showing that with increasing length of stay in the US, you do see an increasing allostatic load among particularly Latino immigrant populations. Length of stay is associated with rising levels of allostatic load among Latinos. And I think that what I call John Henryism is really a part of that social ideology.
Yeah, thank you.
James, thank you very, very much. It was not only a pleasure, but really it was fascinating to hear your story. I had never realized that it could also have been John Henry Martinism. It's amazing. I think now, Coppelia, you have a slide, isn't it? show us something. Yes.
Oh.
Dr. James, we, as a representation of this 172nd Qatar lecture, you have a plaque. And we, contrary to what we normally do, we were so confident that this would be a spectacular Qatar lecture that you already have received it. On Wednesday it came at your home, I understand.
I do have it, and it's prominently displayed in my
Oh,
study.
it's
Thank you so much.
I'm very pleased. And on behalf of the Department of Epidemiology, I may say the whole Harvard Chan School, I thank you so much for this brilliant Qatar lecture. It was a great joy to hear you, and thank you again.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Appreciate it.
With that, I end this presentation of the 172nd Qatar lecture. Thank you, audience, many for your attention.